Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, as you can probably tell, I'm suffering from a very bad cold and a little bit of cough, so be prepared for a little bit of sneezing and wheezing in the show today. Nice to be back with you. I thought we'd maybe hit on two topics this week. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the so-called latest free trade agreement. And maybe we touch on the big European refugee crisis over there where people are fleeing the war and devastation in the Middle East. Starting out with the first one, I'm always amused when I hear these, quote, free trade agreements because it seems to me that they're the furthest thing from a genuine free trade agreement. To me, free trade is trade that is free of government control and management. So when you've got these, extensive secret agreements that consist probably of as many pages as the so-called free trade agreement of NAFTA, that's about as far from genuine free trade it seems that you can get. That here you have governments, officials entering into agreements with government officials. Now, to the extent that they lower tariffs or other protectionist devices, that's good. But anybody who is genuinely committed to free trade would just say, hey, drop your trade restrictions unilaterally. That's what the United States should do. If it truly believes in free trade, which, of course, we know that U.S. officials don't, but the genuine advocate of free trade, it seems to me, Richard, would just say, let's drop all restrictions on Americans of their ability to trade and travel around the world, including, of course, all the sanctions and embargoes that the U.S. has imposed on other countries. What's your take on this thing?
Well, I think that the correct free trade position is that Congress could at any time pass a piece of legislation and the president could sign it, which would merely be either one long sentence or just a couple of sentences that would say that from day X, there are no longer government impediments, prohibitions, restrictions, controls, or in any way influence on the free buying and selling, producing and consuming of goods and services between the citizens of the United States and all other countries around the world, with the government's role still remaining merely the limited but essential ones of securing the population from either violence or fraud. And, of course, the complement to that would be free movement of people as well. That is how the British got rid of many of their mercantilist or protectionist restrictions and regulations in the early decades of the 19th century. As I think we've talked with the listeners before, in the 1700s and the 1600s, in fact, the dominant economic system in Europe was called mercantilism, and that was merely the older version of government central planning, to the extent that their logistics of control enabled them to extend the tentacles of government into everyday life. The governments at that time told what products could be imported and exported, what type of content and ingredients and resources with which they could be manufactured, whether a good needed to be prohibited completely or whether it was going to be subsidized for export by the government. And that was ended with the emergence of the free trade ideas, symbolized by the writings, for example, of Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations. But in the early decades of the 19th century, the 1800s, there emerged a free trade movement in Great Britain led by such prominent figures as Richard Cobden and John Bright. And their goal was the abolition of these trade restrictions, but not to rely upon or depend upon or wait for a mutual or reciprocal trade agreement between Great Britain and other countries. They pushed for unilateral free trade. And it's a fascinating history, one of the great triumphs of liberty in the 19th century. But the bottom line is that by the mid-1840s, they had enough support in Parliament and had swayed the opposition prime minister, Sir Robert Peel, to actually endorse and push through both the House of Commons and their upper house, the House of Lords, a unilateral abolition of all of the agricultural prohibitions, taxes, and restrictions on the importing of less expensive foreign goods, particularly food. What the result is that in June of 1846, without mutual agreement, without reciprocal trade arrangements, Britain just unilaterally eliminated virtually all of its agricultural trade restrictions, freedom of trade in food. This was soon followed with unilateral restrictions on the importing of virtually all manufactured and resource commodities. Did they enter into some reciprocal agreements? Yes. In the 1860s, Britain and France entered into a reciprocal agreement, mutually lowering the trade restrictions and barriers and taxes that remained on many, many goods. But the model and the ideal that the British set for the world was that if free trade is good, it does not matter whether other countries are wise or foolish, whether they lower their trade barriers or stupidly keep them in place at the expense of their own citizens. If free trade is a reasonable, a rational, and beneficial policy, it should be done unilaterally. And that's what Great Britain did. Now, the reason why many people object to this is that there's a conception that the benefit of trade comes from the exporting of goods, and that a negative is anything we import. Why? Because often it's said, well, if we buy goods, we have to pay other countries. If we sell goods, we have to pay them. But the fact is that trade among nations is the same logic of trade among individuals. You specialize in the manufacture of something, a service, for instance, precisely so you can earn the financial wherewithal to import all the goods you desire from others in the society. For example, I'm a professor of economics. I can't fix my own car. I can't grow my own food. I can't manufacture my own clothes. I don't know how to produce my eyeglasses that enables me to see and read better. So what I do, I specialize in the importing of a particular good, and that is teaching services, from which I earn an income from the institution that hires me. And with that financial wherewithal, I proceed to buy all of the other goods that others manufacture and supply to me. I import everything else that I need and consume as a consumer, as a demander. So the benefit of trade is not what I export. That's only the means of earning the financial wherewithal to do what? To import all the things that I desire. Therefore, when we lower trade barriers, the benefit of free trade is what it enables us to buy either at lower prices or in better quality, or to have access to goods that otherwise, under the previous protected regime, we didn't have access to at all. And people just miss that. So lowering trade barriers makes the world's goods less expensive and more available to us. And that's the benefit of free trade. Imports. Exports are just the way to earn the income to pay for them. Now, this type of agreement that we're talking about, this Pacific Trade Agreement, which the President of the United States has signed off on with a variety of other East Asian political leaders, is not a free trade agreement. Now, as you correctly pointed out, Jacob, embedded in this agreement are there clauses in which there will either be an abolition or a significant lowering of many of the existing import taxes on each other's goods, or greater freedom of movement of goods without as many regulatory restrictions on the nature of the good, the content of the good. Yes, and that will be all to the good. But it remains a government-managed treaty in which the government leaders have gotten together under the influence of their respective domestic special interest groups, who are always interested in limiting and hindering competition, both at home and from abroad, to basically determine what type of goods will be imported, in what quantities, with what domestic content, with what scale of lowered but still in place trade barrier tariffs. Now, so basically, this is a politicized trade agreement that goes maybe some way, but not always. And then, if I can just continue a little bit more, a lot of it has the absurd political correctness of the progressive movement of our time. And that is, under the influence of many on the left, the president has been entering in and trying to negotiate clauses that would make foreign labor more expensive, American living wage standards, fair trade. This is basically a way of restricting freedom of employment in other countries that would help others escape from poverty by making it more costly for them to be employed and therefore to sell their goods in the United States, to protect certain business and labor union interests in the United States. And then, of course, there's the environmental regulations. That has nothing to do with securing private property rights to see that no one harms the property of another in the environment. These are ways to basically centrally plan the use and access of resources and environmental regulations that will inhibit and retard the market from functioning and will perversely, in my humble opinion, delay the ability of us to have a cleaner environment in the long run.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the age of mercantilism, because I think you see a lot of that today with this so-called free trade agreement. It's really inherent to empires. I mean, the way they speak with, they're forming a trading bloc, and it's in response to the rival China or some other rivals that might pop up. And so you've got these countries getting together and forming these little exclusive little agreements, which was really, I think, what was going on under the British Empire. And another point is that the people who benefit the most from genuine free trade, when a country just totally abolishes its restrictions unilaterally, are the poor people in society. And you and I have talked about this in a previous show, of how the poor in Great Britain were supporting Cobden and Bright and their anti-Corn Law League and their efforts to abolish the trade restrictions. Because look, let's face it, the trade restrictions are always designed to protect the domestic producer. He's concerned about the competition from overseas of lower cost goods that people might be willing to buy. Well, the people who benefit most from those low-cost goods, assuming they're fairly high quality, are the people at the bottom of the economic ladder. Mm-hmm. So when you have these trade restrictions, inevitably the people who are going to pay the biggest price for them are the poor. So when we libertarians are calling for just unilaterally abolishing all these restrictions, we're really advocating for the rights of the poor to buy the best quality, lowest price products around. So when you combine these two things, the empire speak with the fact that these trade restrictions that inevitably appear in any of these agreements, as you say, the domestic producers are over there all trying to get their best privilege, their best benefit. Inevitably, you're going to have people at the bottom of the economic ladder paying the price. And then one final point, though, is this idea of the trade deficit. There's always this obsession that exports are good and imports are bad. And so the quest is, how do we increase our exports? And you see this in the mainstream press all the time. It is so nonsensical, Richard. And the analogy I use is here in the United States. I mean, we have here in the United States, thanks to the framers, the greatest free trade zone in history. I mean, where people are free to cross state borders in buying and selling, not only movements of people, but just buying and selling of goods. And one of the things that's really always amazed me is how nobody ever frets about the trade imbalance between Virginia and Florida, as an example. What is the situation here between Virginia and Florida? Are they selling more to us than we're selling to them? Which way does the trade imbalance go? Well, nobody cares. It's just not something that enters people's mind. And I've often argued that, hey, if you just abolish that government statistic about how much they're buying and how much we're buying from other countries, it'd be the greatest thing that could ever happen. That people just trade. And why do they trade? In order to increase their standard of living. Because in every trade, as the Austrians have long pointed out, both sides benefit. And so to the extent that government's interfering with that, they're interfering with people's ability to improve their own personal economic well-being.
Yes, to follow through with your point on helping the poor and the misunderstanding about trade balances and trade deficits and so on. The misunderstanding is that when you import a good, it is claimed, it threatens jobs and employments in the United States. And it does not. Let us suppose that you have been buying a domestic version of a product that has been priced at $10 a piece, because that's perhaps the domestic producer's cost of production, we could imagine. Now, let us further imagine that there is a foreign producer who has devised a way to make that product available to you, the American consumer, for half that price, for $5 a piece, and that including the transportation costs from his foreign country to our American home market. Now, when you buy that foreign good, this immediately enables you to have the good for half the price, So what used to cost you $10 now costs you $5, which leaves $5 extra in your pocket to have the financial wherewithal to purchase something, either from another foreign producer or from a domestic manufacturer that you previously could not afford. That's an immediate improvement in the standard of living of every American consumer. You now have the same good that cost you $10 for $5, and you can now afford to buy $5 worth of other goods that previously were beyond your budget's reach. Now, what about the employment? Now, that competition from the foreign rival will act as the very type of competitive stimulus that we often talk about as desirable in a market economy to make the domestic producer have to now devise ways to be able to match his foreign rival. Can he, too, make it as good and as inexpensively as his foreign competitor? If not, he may very well lose market share. He may also be eventually forced out of business. If a rival, to use the American example that you were talking about, Jacob, if a California competitor can do better than a New York competitor in selling to consumers in New York, the New York competitor may go out of business, and the business may be then had completely by the California rival. But what does that mean? It still means the fact that foreign good has to be paid for. The foreign manufacturers do not give goods to American consumers for free. They want to earn dollars so they can purchase things that the dollar will enable them to acquire reciprocally in the marketplace. So they'll spend those dollars, and we will pay for those imports through the exports that they desire to buy from us. Now, the composition of employment, where you work, what kind of work you do, maybe even changing your geographical location may be necessary. But jobs will be created to pay for the imports. Plus, there'll be jobs additionally made, because in my example, where previously what cost $10 is now available for $5, having now an extra $5 in your pocket to spend on other things that previously were beyond your financial reach, that will increase the demand for other products in the American economy. And jobs will therefore be available in those sectors for some of the jobs that perhaps may have been lost from the original domestic producer. So the net change on employment need not in any way be negative. Again, the composition of the employment, what kind of work, in what enterprise, the geographical location of where you have to live to be near your employment may change. But that's the case with all change, all innovation, all market improvements. But it need not involve a net loss of jobs, but will certainly improve the quality and the standard of living of the American consumer and the foreigner, who also then has the greater financial wherewithal to buy American products that he finds more attractive to buy than his own domestic version.
Yeah, that's a great point. That, we often think that standards of living can rise only through, increase of capital and equipment and better productivity, which is certainly a powerful factor in raising standards of living that come about through savings. But the point you're making is that you can increase standards of living just through the simple act of trade. That because when you enter into a trade with somebody, you're giving up something you value less for something you value more. So if you're trading with somebody from California or somebody from Japan or South Africa or whatever, it doesn't matter. That in that trade at that moment, you're improving your standard of living because you're giving up something that you value less for something you value more. And the same applies to him. So standards of living can rise just through a myriad of exchanges. The other thing I wanted to point out is the moral case here is that people have a right to do what they want with their own money. It's their money. Why shouldn't people be free to spend their money any way they want? In Cuba, for example, where, of course, they go to jail right now unless the embargo's lifted. Here in the United States, they go to jail. Well, we libertarians argue that if it's your money, that's what private property is all about. You have a right to go out and trade, spend it wherever you want. Now, we've both alluded to the idea of free movements of goods as well as free movements of people. And so I'd like to segue a little bit there and talk about this refugee crisis. To me, the issues relate to each other. We're talking about the free movements of goods and people here. But when you see this tragedy, Richard, in Europe with these hundreds of thousands of refugees, to me you can't help but think about that inscription on the Statue of Liberty, where Emma Lazarus talks about the wretched refuse of your teeming shores, yearning to breathe free. I mean, this is really what America was all about. You know, those immigrants that were coming in the 19th century when we really did have a situation of open borders. They were the ones that were fleeing the wars of that time, the devastation, the famines. Now, the ironic twist to this crisis, refugee crisis, is that the U.S. empire really is a major contributor to the crises with foreign intervention in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria. I mean, it's sure there may have been some fire there, but what the U.S. did was just take a whole big can of gasoline and pour it on there and continue pouring it on there for the last 13, 14 years, causing these people to try to save their lives by getting over to Europe and, of course, many of them dying in the process. I would say get the troops out of the Middle East, stop the bombing, stop the assassinations, stop the devastation. But in the meantime, open up the borders to the free movements of goods and people, including these people that are just trying to save their lives.
Well, I think that the core point that you're bringing out about American policy and other European countries that have intervened in the Arab world, and by other European countries, I mean the disaster that has become Libya since Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown a few years ago. And at that time, we said America was leading from behind, and that's because basically the British and the French and the Italians were more at the forefront of making the case for that specific intervention. But American and European intervention. What we need to remember is the law of unintended consequences. And that is that whatever the motivation and rationale and reasoning that the U.S. government made to first intervene in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, and that would be an entire different issue from a libertarian or classical liberal perspective to nuance and analysis of that. But the fact is that whatever their motivations and reasons for doing so, they clearly were unaware of and did not pay attention to the dangers of unintended consequences, the disintegration of these societies, the emerging religious rivalries among prominent sects within the Islamic faith, the breakdown of law and order, the rise of resistance movements who, because of nationalistic ideology and propaganda as well as religious ideology, have rose up to oppose American military and political presence in these countries for various reasons. All of this brought about a cataclysmic disruption of these societies. It's not a matter of saying that Saddam Hussein was an angel or Muammar Gaddafi is someone that you wish your sister would have married. The fact is these were evil despots who did cruel and brutal things to their own peoples and had ruled for a very long time. But it doesn't change the fact that in the overthrow of them, it opened up a Pandora's box of social, political, and religious disintegration and conflict that now has spilled over in one version of it in this mass exodus of people just trying to get out of harm's way. This is likely would not have happened, certainly not in the magnitude of this human flow, if it had not been for the unintended consequences of these foreign interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and now through these aerial bombardments and supplying these anti-Assad rebels in Syria as well. Now, given that this has occurred, you have this mass flood of people into Europe across the Mediterranean, where the visual imagery of the media have shown them, many people as of tragically drowning or having to be lifted out of the water for them to be saved. These desperate attempts to get across by land through the Balkans, that is southeastern Europe, to Austria and Germany or Scandinavia. Now, what is a major problem in this, and which was not a problem in open borders in the American experience of the 19th century, and that is that when someone came to America in the 19th and early 20th century, there were no passport requirements, no visa limitations. You arrived, but you were on your own. You had to gain you had to support yourself through your own labor efforts or through the voluntary, peaceful, and charitable endeavors of American associations or people from the same old country who had arrived earlier and gave you sort of a way to get oriented. The problem that is upsetting this and making so much resistance to this, besides any cultural or religious tensions, is basically the economic circumstance. And that is, Europe right now is an intense, extremely regulated and pervasive welfare state. The fact is that these people are hoping and having a dream to enter Germany, because the Germans have said, particularly the Chancellor of Germany, Merkel, come, we're open, we welcome you to escape from violence and war and destruction and possible death. And at least a lot of these people say that they just want a second chance to have a peaceful life, to get a job. The fact is, the German welfare state, like in France, like in Italy, in all of these countries, Scandinavia, the fact is these are pervasive welfare states that what many of these people end up doing is sitting on welfare with government taxpayer subsidies in government housing. And in Germany, they not only give you an apartment, they give you the furniture at welfare taxpayer expense. And eventually what is going to cause a huge, even worse conflict is when these people realize that this is not an opportunity to make a new peaceful life for themselves by getting a job within the economies of these societies, but they're going to be clustered in welfare state-supported communities, isolated from the greater part of the German or French or Italian societies, in which the taxpayers of those societies are going to become increasingly angry and upset that they have to bear greater tax burdens for a growing segment of unemployed and dependent residents and possibly citizens of their countries. So this is the major exacerbation of this, and that is that many Germans, many Austrians, many French, and certainly Eastern European countries are fearful that what is involved is not just cultural and religious tensions of differences that many of the people in these societies are not used to in terms of diversity, is the fear of the fact that this is going to be worsening the stranglehold of what is already an increasingly untenable welfare state. So again, this is an unintended consequence. You set up these entitlement programs, as we now call them, of safety nets and support at taxpayers' expense, where people in perpetuity for themselves and their children can live lives of total state dependency, which will financially weaken these societies and create a further tension between those who receive the government monies and those who narrowly increasingly have to pay for it.
Well, you see the same arguments over here to a certain extent, where people say, oh, no, we got to keep the borders closed until we get rid of the welfare state. Milton Friedman made that argument. I say nonsense well, as far as the United States is concerned, I think most immigrants that come here want to work. They're not going to leave their countries to get on the dole. But to the extent that a certain percentage do, that's certainly no excuse to infringe on the rights of the rest of the people that are just wanting to exercise their God-given rights to live and work and improve their lives. But, when you go back to the 19th century America, we all know, Richard, it wasn't a libertarian paradise. There was slavery. There was a corporatism. There was a lot of violations, land grants to the railroads of libertarian principles. But the basic idea, though, that they came up with, I think was just fantastic. And the fact that we abandoned that idea, I think, is the root cause of America's problems today. That here John Quincy Adams tells Congress on the 4th of July in 1821, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. There were dictators back then. There's always been dictators. There's famines, there's wars, there's revolutions, civil wars. And Adams is saying America's not going to go and fix those things. And so your point is very interesting about Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi and these other dictators, that we don't support that idea, but they develop a somewhat of a stable society where people learn to manage within the dictatorship. But then here's Adams saying, look, if things get really bad, or even if they don't get bad, and you want to leave your country, here's what we'll do for you. We will leave the borders open to the United States. You come here, you're on your own. It's root hog or die. The government's not going to take care of you. But here is a sanctuary for you if you want to get out. That to me was an ideal system. It's what we ought to be trying to get to restore in the United States today. What better way to help people than to establish a free society here at home, while at the same time limiting the government's powers so that there's no big standing military and CIA that's going to go abroad and bomb and assassinate people in the name of helping them.
Yes. The difference between the United States and Europe still, the U.S. is unfortunately moving further and further into the welfare statist forms and intrusiveness that European countries have had for a long time. But in the qualitative sense, the fact is in America, there is still greater labor market flexibility and adaptability. There is still the opportunities, even with the regulations and the taxes, to open a wide array of small and medium-sized businesses and hope to, in a healthy way, still competitively succeed. Those opportunities are far narrower in Europe. And so that means it not only limits the market and employment opportunities of their own domestic populations, but makes it even more burdensome and difficult for the new arrivals. You see, in the United States in the 19th century, and you correctly point out, it was not a classical liberal laissez-faire utopia. It had all the things you talked about, the brutality and immorality of slavery for over half of the 19th century. There were the land grants. There were the government, what they called internal improvements at that time. Those are the government public works that gave contracts to special interest groups for canals and bridges and the roads of those times, and so on and so forth. And the trade protections, because there was always a roller coaster of free trade versus protectionism in the U.S. for most of the 19th century. But in relative terms, the labor market was open, free, and competitive. You came here, you could have a chance to make a living for yourself, a better life for your children, with few impediments. The fact is that there was virtually no regulatory or licensing procedures to start your own business, to expand a business that you have set up, to employ people, not have to worry about a minimum wage or paying unemployment insurance or welfare taxes in the form of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. So that made it more cost efficient to be willing to employ people and take them on and to give people those opportunities. Now, even with our structure, in relative terms, we still have more of those opportunities for the domestic population and the new arrival as either, as we now call it, a legal or illegal immigrant. But in Europe, the tragedy is, again, unintended consequences, is the spider's web of tightly knit welfare state restrictions, regulations, and controls on the labor market and in opening businesses will make it far more difficult for these new arrivals who, in many, many cases, just want to have a new peaceful life for themselves. And maybe some of them, if things settle down in the Middle East, to go back. As some people who came to the United States eventually went back to the old countries in the 19th and early 20th century. These government restrictions will lock them out of those opportunities, and as an unintended consequence, will enhance and increase the tensions in those European societies between the taxpayers and the tax recipients, who will be an easier target because they speak a different language, look a little different, and practice a different faith. And that diversity in that form will make it easier for the demagogues to play upon those people's resentments and fears for political statism in their own countries.
Yeah, what you're painting, it seems to me, is a picture that doesn't have a good ending here. You've got masses of people fleeing the Middle East, in large part because of what the U.S. empire has done, and fleeing into countries where you've got massive welfare states and regulated economies where there's not a lot of job opportunities. That cannot have a happy ending, it seems like to me.
Well, for example, the official unemployment throughout the European Union, it varies significantly from country to country, but is over 10%. Average youth unemployment, that is 16 to 25, is over 15%. Now, that's averaging over the whole European Union. In some European countries, such as Greece or Spain, youth unemployment is far higher. Now, many of these people escaping from war in the Middle East to the European Union are young. Well, that expands that category of youth looking for employment. That is 16 to 25 as the statistics usually classify these people. And that just means that's going to explode those who are at the entry-level working age, who want to learn professions, careers, job skills, to eventually be moving up a ladder of success as one goes through one's professional life and earning a living. And this is going to lock them into poverty and deny them opportunities that, again, will, as an unintended consequence, fester antagonisms and resentments in the society that demagogues and power lusters will play upon in the future. And so Europe may not very well have a very happy ending in many ways because of this.
Yeah, and the people that have their little job secure because of privileges that the state has given them, sort of a throwback to the old guild system, they're not going to welcome all these people in here that are going to possibly take business away from them or take their positions away. But let's face it, I mean, that's why we're fighting for libertarianism, is to show the world that there is a way out of this, and that's to dismantle the welfare state part of this thing, along with all the taxes and inflation that come with it, and dismantle the warfare state side. And then now we're talking about a genuinely free society. But anyway, Richard, We're out of time. Greatly enjoyed the show, as always, and I'll see you next week.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you all next week. Thanks for tuning in.